Why are faithful people still suffering? Why does obedience sometimes feel like exile? And why would a letter written under Rome still sound like it was written for us? First, Peter does not begin with comfort in the modern sense. It begins with identity under pressure. The writer addresses scattered believers, people living as strangers across provinces of Asia Minor, likely in the late 1st century, under growing social and political strain. They are not portrayed as rebels with swords, but as communities learning how to survive suspicion, shame, and public misunderstanding. If you have ever felt outnumbered, unheard, or pushed to the edge for what you believe, this letter speaks in that exact frequency. But here's the thing, Peter does not explain suffering away. He reframes it. He treats pain as a furnace that can expose what is false and refine what is real. Not every hardship is holy, and not every wound is a lesson. But in this text, the fiery trial becomes a testing ground where allegiance is revealed. The message is unsettling because it refuses easy answers. It does not promise quick escape. It calls for sober minds, clean conscience, and a stubborn hope that does not depend on applause. The core claim of this episode is simple. 1 Peter teaches that Christian suffering is not proof of God's absence, but part of a larger pattern in which exiles are formed, Christ is imitated, and judgment begins with the people who bear God's name. In the next minutes, we will move through 4 linked scenes: what it meant to live as exiles in a hostile empire, how the fiery trial of believers was understood, why Christ's suffering is presented as a pattern rather than only an event, and what the warning about judgment beginning at God's house demands from a compromised community. Historically, the background matters, but we will stay careful. Some traditions place Peter in Rome and connect the letter to moments of imperial hostility, including the aftermath of Nero's violence. Others debate authorship, dating, and the exact legal status of the persecutions. Even with those debates, the social reality in the text is clear. Believers are slandered, pressured to conform, and tempted either to hide or to retaliate. Peter rejects both extremes. He calls them chosen and temporary exiles, a paradox that gives dignity without granting triumphalism. Then comes the heat. The letter speaks of a fiery ordeal, language that can point to intense public testing, local persecution, and moral pressure that burns from the inside out. The instruction is not performative heroism. It is endurance with clarity. Bless when cursed. Answer with gentleness. Keep conduct honorable even when accused. This is not passive weakness. It is disciplined resistance, refusing to let hatred set the terms. At the center stands Christ's suffering as pattern. Peter points not first to power, but to the Lamb who endured injustice without deceit, who entrusted judgment to God, and whose wounds become healing for others. For a dark age, this is a dark light. Victory through apparent loss, authority through surrender, life through death. Here's what most people miss. The letter does not glorify pain. It glorifies faithfulness inside pain. And then the warning tightens. Judgment begins at God's house. Before believers denounce the empire, they are summoned to examine themselves. Hypocrisy is not a side issue. It is a spiritual fault line. A holy people cannot borrow the empire's violence and still claim the shepherd's voice. So yes, this book confronts fear, but it also confronts pride. If you are tired, listen closely. You are not forgotten in the fire. If you are drifting, return before the drift hardens into distance. First, Peter is not a map out of suffering. It is a map through it, with eyes open, conscience awake, and hope anchored beyond the reach of Rome. What if the hardest part of faith is not deciding what you believe, but deciding how you will live when belief costs you something? When your choices make you look strange to your own city, your own family, your own social world, does that mean you stepped outside God's care or directly into the place where faith becomes visible? First, Peter opens inside that tension. It speaks to people called elect exiles, scattered across Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, regions in Asia Minor named in the first lines of the letter. Whether those names point to a circular route for delivery or a broader symbolic map of displacement is still discussed, but the emotional landscape is unmistakable. These are people learning to survive as insiders to God and outsiders to their environment at the same time. We should be careful with assumptions. The letter does not read like a report of constant state executions in every town. It sounds more like persistent social hostility, public accusation, mockery, pressure to conform, legal vulnerability, and occasional severe outbreak. That distinction matters because suffering in 1 Peter is not only dramatic martyrdom. It includes what many people quietly carry now, the fatigue of being misunderstood, the ache of being spoken against, the burden of keeping integrity when compromise would be easier. Have you noticed how often the text connects identity to conduct? Chosen race, royal priesthood, holy nation, people for God's possession, and then immediately a call to honorable behavior among the nations. Why tie those together so tightly? Because exile can become either resentment or witness, and Peter seems determined that it become witness. Listen to the contrast line that runs under this whole section. You are rejected by some, but chosen by God. You are slandered, but called to do good. You are socially displaced, yet being built into a spiritual house. That is not denial. It is reframing. If suffering is interpreted only as abandonment, the heart collapses inward. If suffering is interpreted only as heroic identity, the heart becomes proud. Peter avoids both traps. He gives language for dignity without granting permission for arrogance. He gives resistance without hatred. He gives hope without illusion. And where does he place that hope? Not in immediate political reversal, not in social approval, not in guaranteed safety, but in a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ and an inheritance kept in heaven. Some hear that and assume it means ignore the present world. But the letter does the opposite. It intensifies present responsibility. Be sober-minded. Set your hope fully. Be holy in all conduct. Put away malice, deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander. The commands are earthy and practical, not abstract. This is theology under pressure, not theology in a protected room. When Peter addresses authorities, household relations, and community behavior, modern readers may feel friction, and honestly, that friction should not be hidden. Different traditions debate how these instructions functioned within Roman social order and how directly they apply now. But in the text itself, one current is clear. Do not let hostility dictate your character. Do not let injustice train you into becoming unjust. Do not let being treated as lesser make you lose the shape of Christ. That is harder than revenge. It is also harder than retreat. Think of the first-century setting cautiously. Roman imperial culture prized honor, hierarchy, and visible loyalty patterns. New Christian assemblies could appear socially disruptive, even when they were trying to live quietly. Refusal to participate in certain civic or cultic practices could be read as disloyalty. Add rumor, fear, and local power dynamics, and suspicion spreads fast. In that environment, Peter's call to honorable conduct has strategic weight. He is not saying earn salvation by behavior. He's saying behavior can either confirm false accusations or expose them. Conduct becomes testimony, and still, the emotional question remains. If God calls these people beloved, why leave them in this social storm? The letter never gives a neat philosophical formula. Instead, it offers a pattern. Exile is not random drift. Exile can be formation. The furnace does not prove the metal is fake. Sometimes it reveals what kind of metal it is. That does not romanticize pain. It recognizes that pressure reveals allegiance. There is also a warning tucked into the comfort. If believers define themselves only against the surrounding culture, they can become reactive, brittle, and self-righteous. Peter keeps pulling them back to humility, brotherly love, compassion, a tender heart, and a non-retaliatory tongue. Why? Because in a hostile empire, your enemy can live outside you, but the empire's spirit can also move inside you. If you mirror its contempt, you may win an argument and lose your witness. So the first movement of the letter answers part of our main dilemma. Suffering does not automatically mean God has left. It may mean you are being taught how to live as a citizen of another kingdom while standing on contested ground. But that raises an even sharper question. If exile is formation, what exactly is being formed in the fire? And how do you recognize the difference between ordinary hardship and the fiery trial Peter names so directly? When the letter says, "Do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you," the phrase itself burns. Fiery trial can sound poetic, but it is not soft language. It evokes heat, refining, danger, and the possibility of loss. Some interpreters connect this language to broad experiences of persecution under Roman pressure, while others see local, varied episodes rather than one empire-wide policy at that moment. Either way, Peter treats the trial as real enough to wound and serious enough to expose what lies beneath belief. Notice what he does not say. He does not say every pain is persecution. He does not say seek suffering to prove devotion. He does not say trauma is automatically sanctifying. Instead, he draws moral boundaries. Let none of you suffer as a murderer, thief, evildoer, or meddler. If you suffer as a Christian, do not be ashamed. That distinction is crucial. Some suffering is consequence. Some suffering is faithfulness. Confusing those two can damage souls and communities. How do you endure without becoming performative? Peter's answer is surprisingly specific. Keep a good conscience, return blessing for insult, speak with gentleness and respect, do good and be ready to explain your hope. Entrust your soul to a faithful Creator while doing good. This is not theatrical martyr complex. It is disciplined endurance. It rejects both panic and bravado. In a world addicted to escalation, this posture can look weak. Yet the letter presents it as strength under governance. There is mystery in this. Why would God allow a test that hurts people already trying to obey? Peter reaches for the image of refined gold. Gold perishes, yet even gold is tested by fire. Faith, he says, is more precious than gold. We should handle that image carefully. It is metaphor, not mathematical proof. But the pastoral logic is clear. Tested faith can become visible faith. Unquestioned allegiance may be assumed. Pressured allegiance is revealed. Every generation asks the same hidden question. If obedience brings trouble, was obedience the mistake? First Peter answers no, but with nuance. Trouble can come from foolish behavior, so examine yourself honestly. Trouble can come from allegiance to Christ, so do not confuse rejection by a hostile environment with rejection by God. Trouble can also become a stage where your deepest loyalties are made plain to you and to others. There is another contrast. The trial is fiery, but Peter repeatedly commands sobriety. Why place sobriety against fire? Because heat tempts extremes. Heat tempts rage. Heat tempts numbness. Heat tempts self-pity and cruelty. Sober-minded endurance resists all four. It refuses to let pressure decide identity. It keeps prayer alive when adrenaline wants revenge. In this section, community matters as much as individual resilience. Peter speaks to elders, younger believers, and the whole flock. He warns against domineering leadership and urges humility. Why include this in a discourse on suffering? Because trials do not only threaten isolated persons, they reveal the health of the body. Under pressure, leaders can exploit fear, members can turn on one another, and anxiety can masquerade as discernment. Peter counters with mutual submission, vigilance, and trust in the God of all grace. He also names an adversary, the devil, prowling like a roaring lion. Interpretive traditions differ on emphasis and imagery, but the practical effect is unmistakable. Stay alert, resist, firm in faith. Know that your brothers and sisters throughout the world face similar sufferings. Isolation says you are alone. Scripture says you are not. Isolation says your pain is meaningless. Scripture says your pain can be joined to a larger story without being trivialized. And still we should ask the hard pastoral question: what about those who pray and still feel crushed? What about those whose trial lasts years, not weeks? Peter does not give a timeline guarantee. After you have suffered a little while, can feel painfully relative to someone living inside prolonged distress. Yet the promise remains: the God of all grace will restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. Some hear that as future resurrection hope, some as partial present restoration, many as both intention. The letter allows that layered horizon. Here is where the thesis sharpens. Suffering is not framed as divine neglect. It is framed as a context where witness is purified and false supports are burned away. But Peter refuses to leave suffering as an abstract principle. He anchors it in a person. If trial is to form allegiance, what shape should that allegiance take? The next movement answers with unsettling clarity. It takes us to Christ's suffering, not merely as doctrine to affirm, but as a pattern to embody. At the center of 1 Peter stands a paradox that can either transform a community or offend it. Christ suffered for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring us to God. That line is proclamation, but Peter does not stop at proclamation. He turns quickly toward imitation. Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. One movement declares substitution, another calls for participation. The letter holds both. Many believers are comfortable with Christ dying for them. Fewer are comfortable with Christ's suffering becoming the template for their social posture under injustice. Yet Peter insists on it. When reviled, he did not revile in return. When suffering, he did not threaten. He continued entrusting himself to the one who judges justly. That does not mean passivity toward evil in every context. Traditions debate applications in law, politics, and personal protection. But in the immediate frame of 1 Peter, the focus is moral resemblance under pressure. Why is this so hard to accept? Because we instinctively equate power with immediate retaliation. Peter presents another kind of power, restrained, truthful, non-deceptive, and anchored in divine judgment rather than personal vengeance. In a dark channel, this can sound almost too quiet, yet it is the quiet that survives empires. Consider the imagery Peter uses. Jesus as living stone, rejected by humans but chosen by God. Jesus as shepherd and overseer of souls. Jesus bearing sins in his body on the tree so we might die to sin and live to righteousness. These are not decorative metaphors. They reshape imagination. If the Messiah's path included rejection before vindication, why should his people expect uninterrupted approval? If his wounds became means of healing, then suffering in union with him can become witness rather than only wound. Still, caution is needed. This teaching has been misused in history to silence victims and excuse abuse. That misuse must be named. Peter is not commanding people to celebrate evil done to them. He is not blessing oppressors. He is describing how believers can refuse to replicate evil while entrusting final judgment to God. Any application that protects abusers and crushes the vulnerable betrays the letter's moral center. There is also a deep pastoral contrast here. Christ's suffering is unique in redemptive efficacy, once for sins. Our suffering is not redemptive in that same atoning sense, yet our endurance can be participatory witness, a sign that the crucified and risen pattern is now being lived in ordinary bodies. That is why Peter links ethics to identity. You were straying like sheep, but now have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Return first, then endure. Belong first, then witness. A difficult passage often appears in this section. Christ proclaimed to the spirits in prison, connected to the days of Noah. Interpretations vary widely across church history. Some read it as proclamation of victory, some as declaration of judgment, some as complex typology connected to baptism and deliverance through water. In cautious documentary tone, we should admit uncertainty rather than force confidence. But even here, Peter's rhetorical movement seems consistent. The story of Christ runs through death into vindication, and believers are invited to read their own suffering through that arc. Then comes baptism language, not as removal of dirt from the body, but as appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Again, the conscience appears. In Peter, conscience is not private mood. It is covenant orientation, an inner alignment that empowers outward integrity. Why emphasize conscience while discussing suffering? Because once public pressure rises, conscience becomes either compass or casualty. Ask yourself this contrast question. Is faith mainly agreement with statements, or allegiance that survives humiliation without hatred? Peter pushes toward the second without abandoning the first. Doctrine and posture belong together. If Christ is Lord, then how you endure insult becomes theological speech. This is why the thesis says suffering is a refining context for witness. Witness here is not loud branding. It is recognizable resemblance. A community that answers cursing with blessing, slander with honorable conduct, fear with hope, and injury with truthful restraint becomes strange in the best way. Strange enough to provoke questions. Strange enough to challenge empire logic. Strange enough to reveal that another kingdom is already at work. And yet, even this is not the final edge of Peter's argument. We might be tempted to apply all judgment outward, to Rome, to hostile neighbors, to persecutors. Peter turns the blade inward before it points outward. Judgment begins, he says, at the household of God. If Christ is the pattern and suffering is the furnace, what happens when the fire reaches the church itself? Judgment beginning at God's house may be the most unsettling line in the letter for religious audiences. It interrupts the easy storyline where faithful people are only victims and never participants in corruption. Peter does not deny external hostility. He has named it repeatedly. But he refuses to let external threat become an excuse for internal decay. Before denouncing the empire, examine your own walls. Before demanding justice outside, purge deceit inside. What kind of judgment is in view? Traditions differ on emphasis. Some hear present purifying discipline, some hear eschatological horizon breaking into present accountability. Many hear both. Whatever the precise frame, the practical force is immediate. God's people are not exempt from scrutiny. Privilege does not cancel holiness. Identity language does not shield hypocrisy. This strikes at a modern temptation. Under pressure, communities often bond by shared enemies. That can create short-term unity while hiding long-term rot. Peter does the opposite. He builds identity, then tests identity. Are you holy in conduct or only loud in slogans? Are your leaders shepherding willingly, not for shameful gain? Are younger members clothed with humility? Are you resisting pride that quietly feeds on persecution narratives? The letter's warnings against malice, deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander are not side notes. They are diagnostics. A church can preach courage while practicing contempt. It can denounce Babylon while imitating Babylon's methods. Peter sees that danger. He calls believers to resist the empire's spirit, not merely its pressure. Notice how this answers our main question in full form. Does pain prove God is absent? Peter says no. But he also says suffering is not a moral blank check for believers. Trial can refine allegiance only if the community submits to God's judgment first. Otherwise, suffering hardens into self-righteousness. Fire can purify, but fire can also expose that some cherished habits are combustible and must be abandoned. There is pastoral weight here. If you have been wounded by religious hypocrisy, this text does not tell you to ignore it. It names judgment in the house of God. If you are tempted to spiritual pride because you have endured much, this text warns you too. If you are exhausted and quietly faithful, this text sees you and calls your endurance meaningful, not wasted. Peter's closing instructions gather the whole argument. Humble yourselves under God's mighty hand. Cast all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Be sober-minded and watchful. Resist the adversary. Stand firm in grace. These are not disconnected commands. They form one posture: humility without collapse, vigilance without paranoia, resistance without hatred, hope without denial. The mysterious power of this letter is that it refuses both naive triumph and cynical despair. It does not claim believers are always safe. It does not claim suffering is always understandable. It does claim that suffering can become a place of tested allegiance, Christ-shaped witness, and internal purification. That is a darker, truer hope than instant deliverance promises. So where does that leave us now, far from first-century Asia Minor, and yet strangely close to its pressures? It leaves us with a decision. Will we read 1 Peter as historical artifact only, or as living summons? Will we treat exile language as poetic nostalgia, or as a framework for faithful presence in contested cultures? Will we use suffering to justify revenge, or let suffering train us into non-retaliatory courage anchored in the judge who sees all? A final contrast may help. The Empire says, protect your honor at any cost. Peter says, entrust your honor to God and keep doing good. The Empire says, strike first to avoid shame. Peter says, bless even when reviled and let conscience remain clean. The Empire says, power is domination. Peter says, power is faithfulness that endures without becoming cruel. If that sounds impossible, maybe that is the point. The pattern is not sustained by human willpower alone. Peter roots it in grace, resurrection hope, shared suffering across the global church, and the shepherd who keeps souls when circumstances cannot be controlled. The call is demanding, but not abandoned, severe, but not loveless. And this returns us to the opening dilemma. Social exile and hostility do not automatically announce God's absence. In 1 Peter, they can mark the terrain where allegiance is refined, Christ's pattern is embodied, and God's house is purified before judgment reaches wider horizons. The question is not whether fire exists. The question is what the fire is revealing in us. Hold that question as we move forward, because once judgment begins at God's house, no mask survives for long, and what is uncovered next may be the most uncomfortable part of all. So where have we arrived after walking through this letter in the dark? We began with a painful question. If faithful people suffer, if obedience can feel like exile, if hostility keeps finding those trying to live cleanly, has God stepped back, or are we standing inside a harder kind of calling? First, Peter answers without pretending life is simple. It does not remove the fire. It gives meaning inside the fire. 3 takeaways hold the entire arc together. First, exile is not always failure. In this letter, believers are named as chosen and scattered at the same time, strangers in a world that does not share their allegiance. That tension is not accidental background noise, it is part of their identity formation. In a hostile social order, faithfulness becomes visible through conduct, not noise. The pressure to blend in, retaliate, or hide is real, but Peter keeps returning to honorable presence. You are not told to disappear. You are told to remain distinct without becoming cruel. Second, the fiery trial is framed as testing, not abandonment. That does not mean every hardship is holy, and Peter is careful to separate suffering for wrongdoing from suffering for Christ's name. This distinction protects the conscience. It prevents spiritual confusion. It also prevents religious theater. The letter rejects both panic and performance. Endurance is not pretending nothing hurts. Endurance is doing good, speaking with gentleness, and refusing to let evil teach you its own language. Third, Christ's suffering is not only doctrine to admire from a distance, it is a pattern to embody under pressure, while judgment begins with God's own house. This is where the letter becomes most uncomfortable and most honest. Before believers accuse the empire, they are summoned to self-examination. Hypocrisy cannot be hidden behind persecution language. Pride cannot be baptized as courage. If the household of God is being purified, then integrity is not optional. It is the evidence that hope is real. A few historical details remain debated, and we should name that briefly. The exact dating, authorship discussions, and the scope of persecution contexts in relation to specific imperial moments are still contested. The difficult passage about proclamation to the spirits in prison has multiple historic interpretations. But even where details are disputed, the letter's moral trajectory is strikingly clear. Suffering does not automatically certify holiness, and it does not automatically signal divine absence. It can become a refining context where allegiance is exposed, witness is sharpened, and a compromised community is called back to its center. That center is not stoicism, it is not denial, it is not revenge delayed. It is living hope through the risen Christ, practiced as sober-minded endurance in ordinary relationships, speech, leadership, and conflict. A church can survive external hostility and still collapse internally through deceit, envy, and contempt. Peter refuses that collapse. He ties hope to holiness, and holiness to love, and love to disciplined restraint. If you are in a season where faith feels costly, hear this quietly. Your pain is not proof that God has abandoned you, but your pain is also not permission to abandon the way of Christ. Hold both truths together. That tension may be where transformation happens. If this episode sharpened your view of suffering and witness, share it with one person walking through their own fire. And now, one last question before we move on. If judgment begins at God's house, what hidden compromise would the fire expose in us first? Take a second, and based on what we uncovered today, answer this in the comments. Do you think your suffering feels like abandonment or a call to faithful endurance? And as always, God bless you.